My mother-in-law forged the will until I played the secret recording in court. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I watched my mother-in-law wipe a fake tear from her eye and swear on the Bible, while my thumb hovered over the play button. My name is Chloe, and I am 32 years old. Until exactly 7 months ago, I had a beautiful, perfectly ordinary life with the man of my dreams, my husband David. David was 34, a brilliant architect with a laugh that could fill a stadium and a heart that was entirely too good for the family he was born into. We lived in a stunning, cozy mid-century modern home that we had spent the last 4 years painstakingly renovating together. It was our sanctuary, the place we planned to raise children and grow old. But sitting in this sterile, wood-paneled probate courtroom today, watching the woman who birthed him perform the greatest acting job of her miserable life, all those dreams felt like a distant, cruel illusion. Beatrice, my wealthy, narcissistic mother-in-law, was currently on the witness stand, wearing an obscenely expensive black morning suit. She was trying to convince a judge that her own son, in his final days, had legally decided to leave me absolutely nothing. According to her, David had suddenly drafted a brand new will, completely disinheriting his beloved wife, leaving our entire estate, our savings, and our beautifully renovated marital home exclusively to her. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table next to my attorney, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was wearing the simple black dress I wore to David's funeral, a stark contrast to Beatrice's designer grief. For months, this woman had systematically tried to destroy my life, weaponizing her bottomless bank account and her staggering arrogance to force me out onto the street. She had manipulated the legal system, hired expensive accomplices, and tortured a grieving widow simply because she never liked me. She truly believed that because she had millions of dollars and a terrifying reputation in this city, she was completely untouchable. She believed I was just a weak, broken little girl who would eventually fold under the overwhelming pressure and walk away empty-handed. But Beatrice made one catastrophic, irreversible mistake when she decided to maliciously forge my dead husband's final wishes. She never realized I had a hidden weapon poised to destroy her completely. My life with David was a masterclass in unconditional love and quiet rebellion. From the day we met at a local coffee shop, he made it abundantly clear that he wanted a life completely separate from the toxic, status-obsessed world of his mother, Beatrice. She was the kind of woman who judged human worth strictly by zip codes, designer labels, and bank account balances. Because I was a public school teacher from a working-class background, Beatrice immediately despised me. She refused to attend our small, intimate wedding, telling David he was making a catastrophic financial mistake. David didn't care. He shielded me from her venom, creating a beautiful, warm bubble of a life where we were safe. We spent our weekends painting our living room, cooking elaborate dinners, and dreaming of the future. But that perfect, safe bubble violently popped on a rainy Tuesday evening. David was driving home from work when a distracted driver ran a red light, T-boning his car at highway speeds. The agonizing phone call from the emergency room is permanently burned into my memory. I rushed to the hospital in a blind panic, my entire world collapsing into a blur of sterile white hallways and the terrifying, rhythmic beeping of medical machines. David suffered catastrophic head trauma. He was placed in a medically induced coma the moment he arrived to relieve the swelling in his brain. The doctors were grim, offering very little hope. I sat by his bed for 3 days, holding his cold hand, begging him to wake up. Beatrice arrived on the second day. She didn't cry. She didn't hug me. She walked into the intensive care unit wearing a crisp business suit, took one look at her unconscious son hooked up to a ventilator, and immediately turned to me with eyes like chips of ice. "Have you located his estate planning binder yet, Chloe?" she demanded, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "We need to secure his assets before the hospital tries to claim anything." I was utterly paralyzed by the sheer sociopathy of her calculating words. I watched my husband dying while his mother coldly planned her financial takeover. David passed away quietly on a Thursday morning, leaving me completely shattered and drowning in an ocean of unbearable grief. The funeral was a surreal, exhausting nightmare. Beatrice hijacked the entire memorial service, turning it into a morbid networking event for her wealthy socialite friends, actively pushing me to the literal back of the room. I was too emotionally destroyed to fight her. I just wanted to go home, curl up in the bed David and I shared, and try to remember how to breathe. 2 short weeks later, while I was still struggling to simply get out of bed each morning, I received a cold, formal summons from Beatrice's personal attorney. She demanded I come to her opulent, sterile mansion for the official reading of David's will. I was confused. David and I had drafted simple, matching wills shortly after we bought our house, leaving everything to each other. It was standard, uncomplicated, and perfectly legally sound. But when I arrived at Beatrice's sprawling estate and sat awkwardly in her massive, mahogany-paneled study, she slid a thick, unfamiliar document across the table. David came to his senses right before the end, she announced, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. He drafted a revised will to ensure his assets stayed within the actual blood family. I stared at the crisp white paper, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I read the terrifying words. According to this new document, David had entirely revoked our original will. He allegedly left his life insurance policy, all his investment accounts, and, most devastatingly, our beautiful marital home solely to his mother. The document designated me a meager, insulting lump sum of $10,000 and demanded I vacate the property immediately upon his death. The air in the room suddenly became incredibly thin, and I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. This was undeniably wrong. My husband would never do this to me. I looked up to see Beatrice staring at me with pure, unadulterated malice. Beatrice didn't even attempt to maintain her facade of polite grieving. As I sat there hyperventilating in her study, clutching the horrifying document, she completely dropped the act and leaned aggressively across her massive desk. "You never belonged in our family, Chloe," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. David was temporarily blinded by some misguided savior complex, but he finally realized you were just a financial parasite. "I am giving you exactly 30 days to pack your cheap little bags and vacate my property. If you leave quietly and don't make a humiliating public scene, I will gladly hand over your pitiful $10,000 parting gift." I was utterly paralyzed. The sheer cruelty of her eviction threat, delivered just weeks after I buried the absolute love of my life, was genuinely impossible to process. She was trying to strip away the only sanctuary I had left, the home filled with David's memories, his scent, and our shared dreams. I stumbled out of her mansion, clutching a photocopy of the supposed new will, tears blinding my vision as I drove back to the house she was trying to steal. I sat at my kitchen table for hours, staring blankly at the legal jargon, feeling completely defeated by her immense wealth and terrifying power. I assumed I was going to lose everything. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our beautifully renovated kitchen, the dense fog of my grief slowly started to lift, replaced by a sudden, razor-sharp spike of adrenaline. I turned on the overhead light and began reading the document again, this time ignoring the legal threats and focusing entirely on the raw details. I meticulously scanned the signatures, the dates, and the notary stamps, looking for anything that might explain why David would do this. That is when my eyes locked onto a tiny, glaringly impossible detail printed neatly at the very bottom of the last page. My heart completely stopped as a terrifying realization crashed down upon me. The impossible detail was the date written neatly next to David's signature. According to the document, this allegedly finalized will was signed, witnessed, and notarized on October 14th. I stared at that date until the numbers physically blurred, a cold, sickening realization spreading rapidly through my veins. October 14th was a Tuesday. It was exactly 2 days after the catastrophic car accident. On October 14th, my husband was lying motionless in a critical care hospital bed, heavily sedated and hooked up to a ventilator, deep in a medically induced coma. It was physically, medically, and entirely legally impossible for him to have signed any legal document, let alone a complex estate revision. My hands began to shake with a completely new emotion, absolute, blinding rage. Beatrice hadn't just manipulated a grieving son. She had brazenly, maliciously forged a legal document to steal my home and erase my existence from David's legacy. I grabbed a magnifying glass from David's desk and carefully examined the signature itself. To the naked eye, it looked somewhat like his handwriting, but under the glass, the lines were incredibly shaky, hesitant, and entirely unnatural. It didn't look like a fluid signature. It looked exactly like someone had meticulously traced it from an older document. I flipped to the witness page. The two names listed as official witnesses were Arthur Pendleton and Eleanor Vance. I instantly recognized Arthur. He was Beatrice's shady, longtime personal accountant who attended all her lavish parties. I didn't know Eleanor, but I was absolutely certain she was just another one of Beatrice's highly paid lackeys. The audacity of this crime was absolutely staggering. She genuinely thought I would be too blinded by my intense grief and too intimidated by her immense wealth to actually verify the dates. She assumed my trauma made me an incredibly easy target. I finally wiped the tears from my cheeks, my sadness hardening into an unbreakable, icy resolve. She wanted to play a ruthless legal game to destroy my life. I was going to make sure she lost absolutely everything. The very next morning, I secured an emergency consultation with Attorney Hayes, a sharp, highly skeptical probate lawyer known for taking on complex estate disputes. I sat in his modest office and laid out my explosive evidence. The forged will, David's extensive medical records proving he was comatose on the date of the signature, and our original, legitimate will. Hayes reviewed the documents with intense focus, his brow furrowing as he cross-referenced the dates. Finally, he leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen against his desk with a heavy sigh. "Chloe, you are absolutely right. The date discrepancy is a massive red flag, and the signature looks highly suspicious," he said slowly, managing my expectations. "But you need a serious reality check about how probate court actually operates. Beatrice has bottomless resources. She has submitted a notarized document with 2 sworn witnesses, including her accountant Arthur, who are legally prepared to testify under oath that they saw David sign this on a different day and simply wrote the wrong date by mistake." I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. "But he was in a coma," I protested desperately. Hayes nodded sympathetically. "I know, but handwriting experts are notoriously unreliable in court, and Beatrice will just hire 3 experts to contradict ours. She will claim David signed it before the accident, and the notary simply made a clerical error with the date stamp. With her money, she can drag this out in civil litigation for years, completely bankrupting you in the process." He looked me dead in the eyes, his expression deadly serious. "Suspicion is not proof, Chloe. Pointing out a bad date won't guarantee a win against a billionaire who buys her own witnesses. If we are going to accuse a prominent socialite of felony forgery and conspiracy, we need an absolute smoking gun. We need concrete, undeniable proof that she orchestrated this fraud, or she will crush you and take your home." I walked out of his office feeling sick, terrified that her money would actually win. I realized immediately that I had to secure a confession. I spent 3 days agonizing over a plan, desperately trying to figure out how to trap a woman who spent her entire life manipulating everyone around her. Beatrice was incredibly arrogant, deeply narcissistic, and fundamentally believed she was the smartest person in any room. That towering ego was her only weakness, and I realized I had to strategically use it against her. I formulated a highly risky plan that required me to swallow every ounce of my pride and play the exact character she believed me to be, the weak, broken, financially desperate little widow. I picked up my phone and called her private number, forcing my voice to tremble and crack with manufactured anxiety. When she finally answered with a cold, dismissive sigh, I began to practically beg. "Beatrice, please," I whimpered into the receiver, sounding utterly defeated. "I've spoken to a lawyer, but I can't afford the retainer fees to fight you in court. I'm completely out of money, and the stress is destroying me. I just want this nightmare to be over. Can I please come over to your house to discuss a private settlement?" There was a long, incredibly tense pause on the line. I held my breath, praying she would take the bait. I knew she couldn't resist the glorious opportunity to personally gloat over my complete surrender. "Fine," she snapped sharply, her voice dripping with triumphant condescension. "Come to my study tomorrow at noon. And do not bring your cheap lawyer. This is strictly a family discussion." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking violently with adrenaline. I spent the rest of the evening preparing for the performance of a lifetime. I bought a state-of-the-art, incredibly small digital voice recorder and spent hours practicing how to activate it seamlessly without looking down. I planned exactly what to say to stroke her massive ego and make her feel entirely invincible. I was walking directly into the lion's den, armed only with my grief and a tiny microphone. I was terrified, but I was finally ready for war. I arrived at Beatrice's massive, intimidating mansion exactly at noon, wearing a wrinkled sweater and looking intentionally exhausted. I walked into her mahogany-paneled study with my purse clutched tightly to my chest, my phone's high-definition voice recorder already silently running inside a side pocket. Beatrice was sitting behind her desk, sipping tea and looking at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. I immediately launched into my performance, weeping softly and begging for a larger settlement so I could afford a small apartment. Beatrice reveled in my apparent misery. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious triumph. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Chloe?" she sneered, completely dropping her guard in the privacy of her own home. "David was my son, and his money belongs in this family, not with some gold-digging school teacher." I forced myself to sob louder, leaning into the trap. "But why did you do it, Beatrice?" I cried pathetically. "Why did you forge his signature?" "I saw the date. You know he was in a coma." Beatrice laughed, a harsh, terrifying sound that echoed off the expensive wood paneling. Her towering arrogance completely blinded her to the danger. "Because you didn't deserve a single dime of my family's wealth." She gloated proudly, explicitly confessing to the crime. "So what if I had Arthur trace his signature from an old tax return? Arthur owed me a massive favor, and the notary is on my payroll. No judge in this city is going to believe a hysterical, penniless widow over me. The date was a stupid clerical error, but I have 2 sworn witnesses who will lie through their teeth for me. You have absolutely nothing, Chloe. Now, take the $10,000 and get out of my son's house, or I will ensure you leave with nothing but legal debt." My heart hammered violently against my ribs as her crystal-clear confession perfectly recorded onto my hidden device. I had done it. I wiped my fake tears, nodded submissively, and quietly backed out of her opulent study. I walked out to my car and securely locked the doors before finally exhaling. I drove away from Beatrice's sprawling estate, shaking with so much adrenaline I could barely keep the steering wheel straight. The moment I parked in my driveway, I pulled the digital recorder from my purse and played the audio back. Beatrice's cruel, arrogant voice filled the car, explicitly admitting to the felony forgery, the conspiracy with Arthur, and the bribery of the notary public. It was the most beautiful, devastating piece of evidence I had ever heard. I immediately drove straight to Attorney Hayes's office and slammed the recorder onto his desk. "Listen to this," I demanded, my voice shaking with raw excitement. Hayes pressed play, leaning in closely. As Beatrice's confession echoed through the small office, his jaw literally dropped. He listened to the entire recording twice in absolute, stunned silence. When it finished, he looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep professional respect. "Chloe," he breathed heavily, shaking his head in disbelief. "This isn't just a smoking gun. This is a nuclear bomb. You just handed me a guaranteed felony conviction." I smiled, a cold, hard satisfaction replacing my lingering grief. "So, we take this to the police right now?" I asked eagerly. Hayes held up a hand, a wicked, incredibly strategic gleam appearing in his eyes. "No," he said smoothly. "If we show our hand now, her expensive defense lawyers will scramble, claim the audio is deep-faked, and try to settle quietly out of court. We need her to permanently destroy herself." He leaned across the desk, outlining a terrifying but brilliant legal strategy. We were going to maintain total silence. We would pretend we had no evidence, allowing Beatrice to confidently submit the forged will to the probate court under penalty of perjury. We would let her and Arthur officially lie on the permanent legal record, committing multiple new felonies in the process. We were going to build a massive, inescapable legal trap and let her willingly walk right into the center of it. We just had to wait patiently for our day in court. The next 2 months were a grueling, nerve-wracking exercise in strategic patience. Beatrice officially submitted the forged will to the probate court, initiating the formal legal process to seize my home. The pretrial deposition phase began, and it was agonizingly difficult to sit in that sterile conference room and play the role of the defeated victim. Beatrice arrived at the depositions wearing expensive designer suits, looking incredibly smug and completely untouchable. When Attorney Hayes gently questioned her about the circumstances of the will's signing, she lied with breathtaking ease. She swore under oath, on the official legal record, that David had handed her the signed document just days before his tragic accident, claiming the notary had simply stamped the wrong month by mistake. She looked directly at me with a cold, triumphant smirk while she committed felony perjury. Arthur, the shady accountant, was deposed the following week. He confidently corroborated Beatrice's entire fabricated story, swearing under oath that he physically watched David sign the document with a steady hand. He even added entirely fake emotional details about how David supposedly expressed deep regret for marrying me. It took every ounce of my willpower not to scream and flip the heavy conference table. I sat silently next to Hayes, tightly clutching my hands in my lap, digging my fingernails into my palms to keep from reacting. I had to let them build their towering house of lies as high as possible. Hayes played his part perfectly, acting like a frustrated, outmatched lawyer desperately grasping at straws. He barely pushed back, lulling Beatrice and her expensive legal team into a deep, incredibly false sense of absolute security. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted us, flawlessly executing the perfect crime to steal a dead man's legacy. They strutted out of the deposition rooms, completely unaware that their sworn testimonies had just permanently sealed their impending doom. I watched them walk to their luxury cars, knowing a devastating storm was coming. The highly anticipated court date finally arrived on a chilly Tuesday morning. The wood-paneled probate courtroom was incredibly tense, filled with Beatrice's wealthy friends who had shown up to watch her easily crush the poor, grieving widow. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Hayes, my stomach tied in agonizing knots, my heart pounding so loudly I was terrified the judge could hear it. Beatrice sat across the aisle, looking like a flawless, tragic matriarch in a tailored black suit. When the proceedings began, Beatrice's high-priced attorney presented the forged will to the judge with absolute confidence, painting a wildly false narrative of a dying son desperately trying to protect his family wealth from a manipulative outsider. When Beatrice was called to the witness stand, she delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She wept softly into a lace handkerchief, speaking in a trembling voice about how much she loved David and how heartbroken she was to carry out his harsh but supposedly true final wishes. The elderly judge listened intently, visibly moved by her fake display of maternal grief. She played the courtroom perfectly, manipulating the optics to make me look like a greedy squatter refusing to accept reality. I watched her wipe a totally fake tear from her eye, feeling a cold, righteous anger completely wash away any remaining anxiety. She believed she had won. She firmly believed her money and her incredible acting skills had successfully stolen my home, my financial security, and my husband's true legacy. She confidently adjusted her posture in the witness box, completely ready to finalize the theft. The judge nodded sympathetically at her before turning to our table, asking if we had any questions for the grieving mother. Hayes slowly stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a calm, terrifyingly precise deliberation. The entire courtroom fell incredibly silent as my lawyer slowly approached the witness stand. The trap was fully set, and it was finally time to absolutely destroy her. Hayes approached the witness stand with a completely neutral expression, holding a simple legal notepad. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet courtroom, "you have just sworn under oath that your son, David, willingly and personally signed this revised will in the presence of yourself and your accountant, Arthur, correct?" Beatrice lifted her chin arrogantly, completely unbothered. "Yes, that is exactly what I said," she replied coldly. Hayes paced slowly in front of her. "And you maintain that the signature on this document is absolutely genuine, not traced or forged in any capacity, despite the tragic fact that your son was completely comatose on the dates stamped by the notary?" Beatrice let out a sharp, condescending sigh, looking at the judge as if asking for protection from a foolish child. "I have already explained this exhaustively," she snapped, her mask of grief slipping to reveal her true arrogance. "The notary made a clerical error with the date stamp. David signed it days before his terrible accident. My son wanted to protect his assets from a woman who clearly only cared about his bank account. I swear on the Holy Bible, that is his true signature. Hayes stopped pacing and looked directly into her eyes, a sharp, incredibly dangerous smile slowly spreading across his face. So, you categorically deny having Arthur trace your son's signature from an old tax return? You deny stating that your daughter-in-law didn't deserve a single dime of your family's wealth? Beatrice's face flushed a deep, angry red at the shockingly specific accusation. She slammed her hand down on the wooden rail of the witness box. That is an outrageous, completely fabricated lie. She yelled furiously, committing her final, fatal act of perjury on the record. I demand to know where you are getting these ridiculous, defamatory accusations. Hayes didn't flinch. He calmly turned his back on her, walking back to our table and picking up a small, highly amplified Bluetooth speaker. Your Honor, Hayes said clearly, his voice dripping with pure legal venom. At this time, the plaintiff would like to submit Exhibit C into evidence. The judge frowned, leaning forward over his heavy wooden bench. Exhibit C, Mr. Hayes? I don't see that listed in the preliminary discovery file, he noted with confusion. Hayes nodded respectfully. That is correct, Your Honor. It is newly acquired evidence that directly and fundamentally impeaches the witness's current sworn testimony. With the court's permission, I would like to play a brief audio recording. Beatrice's high-priced lawyer immediately jumped to his feet, shouting loud, frantic objections about unverified evidence, but the judge firmly overruled him, deeply intrigued by Hayes's supreme confidence. I reached over, my fingers trembling slightly with adrenaline, and pressed the play button on my phone, which was synced to the loud Bluetooth speaker on our table. The crystal-clear audio filled the incredibly silent courtroom. First, my fake, weeping voice echoed off the wood paneling, begging for a settlement. Then came Beatrice's voice. It was incredibly loud, dripping with unmistakable malice and absolute arrogance. Because you didn't deserve a single dime of my family's wealth. So what if I had Arthur trace his signature from an old tax return? Arthur owed me a massive favor, and the notary is on my payroll. No judge in this city is going to believe a hysterical, penniless widow over me. The recording continued, broadcasting her explicit admission of forgery and bribery to the entire shocked room. The silence that followed the audio was absolutely deafening, heavy, and incredibly suffocating. I looked directly at the witness stand. Beatrice had turned a terrifying, sickly shade of ghost white, her mouth hanging completely open in silent horror. Her expensive defense attorney buried his face in his hands, fully realizing his entire legal career was suddenly in extreme jeopardy. In the gallery behind me, several of Beatrice's wealthy socialite friends audibly gasped in pure shock. The grand illusion of the grieving, untouchable matriarch was instantly and violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Beatrice frantically looked around the room, desperate for an escape. The judge's reaction was absolutely terrifying to witness. His face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson as he violently slammed his wooden gavel down, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot in the stunned courtroom. Order, he roared, though no one was actually speaking. He pointed a shaking, incredibly angry finger directly at Beatrice, who was now visibly trembling in the witness box. Mrs. Vance, you have just brazenly lied to this court under oath. You have submitted a maliciously forged document in a pathetic attempt to defraud a grieving widow, and you have openly confessed to felony conspiracy. Beatrice completely panicked, her massive ego instantly shattering. She desperately pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the courtroom. It was Arthur. She shrieked hysterically, throwing her lifelong accomplice completely under the bus. Arthur told me how to do it. He traced the signature. I didn't know it was highly illegal. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Arthur, who was sitting in the gallery, leaped out of his seat and frantically tried to run for the heavy oak doors, but two large bailiffs quickly intercepted him, forcefully pushing him back into the pews. The judge furiously ordered the immediate dismissal of the forged will, officially validating my original claim to the entire estate. But he was far from finished. He looked directly at the court reporter, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. I am immediately holding Beatrice Vance and Arthur Pendleton in direct contempt of court, he stated fiercely. Furthermore, I am officially referring this entire transcript and the audio evidence to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution on charges of felony forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of perjury. Beatrice let out a loud, pathetic wail, completely collapsing into her chair as a bailiff approached the witness stand to escort her out. I sat at my table, perfectly still, letting out a long, heavy breath I felt like I had been holding for 7 agonizing months. My beautiful home was finally, truly safe. The legal and social fallout for Beatrice was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating. The district attorney eagerly accepted the judge's referral, and within weeks, Beatrice and Arthur were formally indicted on multiple felony charges. Faced with the undeniable, crystal-clear audio recording of her arrogant confession, her incredibly expensive defense team couldn't save her. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, she was forced to accept a humiliating plea deal that included massive financial fines, a terrifying period of strict house arrest, and years of heavily monitored probation. The scandal completely destroyed her pristine public image. Her wealthy socialite friends entirely abandoned her, refusing to be associated with a convicted fraudster. Arthur lost his accounting license permanently, and the corrupt notary was quickly prosecuted. David's true, original will was officially honored by the court, legally securing my absolute ownership of our beautifully renovated marital home and all his hard-earned assets. I spent the next few months slowly and quietly healing in the sanctuary we had built together, finally able to properly grieve my incredible husband without the terrifying threat of eviction hanging over my head. I framed a beautiful photo of David and placed it on the kitchen counter, finding immense peace in knowing I had fiercely and successfully protected his true legacy. The entire traumatic ordeal fundamentally changed me, forging an unbreakable core of resilience I never knew I possessed. I learned the hardest possible way that toxic, wealthy bullies will always rely on your silence and your fear to manipulate the system and steal what is rightfully yours. But they also possess massive, blinding egos that can be expertly used against them if you remain entirely calm, extremely strategic, and perfectly patient. Never let anyone, no matter how powerful or intimidating they seem, convince you that you are too weak to fight back for what you love. The truth is incredibly powerful, and it will always find a way to step into the light.